All right, everyone. A very good evening to all of you. Welcome to the 10th installment of the Russian Revolution series of demystifying NCRT. And if you remember that in the last installment, we had actually looked at the February Revolution of 1917. Today, what we are perhaps going to be doing is that we are going to be exploring what essentially happened, right? What essentially happened after the February Revolution, right? So, what essentially happened after the February Revolution, right? So, because every revolution is going to have some particular consequences, right? And it would be best for us to understand what precisely were those consequences and how did they look like. Right. So if we look at what exactly happened after the February Revolution, the first and the foremost thing that one needs to understand is the very fact that the February Revolution of 1917, right, the February Revolution of 1917 brought an end to the monarchy, right? That is something which really needs to be understood very, very well. Okay, so the February Revolution of 1917 brought an end to the monarchy, right? And you also remember the fact that there was the establishment of something that is known as the provisional government. Yes, there was an establishment of a particular entity known as the provisional government, which was basically a collaboration between the Soviet leaders, right? It was a collaboration between the Soviet leaders and the Duma leaders, right? Now, if I talk about the provisional government, you will realize that there were a lot of influential figures in this provisional government. There were army officers who were influential. Then you had landowners who were influential. And then, of course, you had the industrialists as well as a part of the provisional government, right? So these were people who essentially formed a part of the provisional government, which was now established to run the country, right? Then of course, what do you have? You have restrictions on workers' associations and trade unions, etc. All those restrictions that were earlier placed on all these unions and associations, these restrictions were lifted, right? Because earlier, if you remember, these associations had been banned by the Tsar. Now the restrictions were lifted, right? And you had the Soviets, okay, just like the Petrograd Soviet, okay, just like the Petrograd Soviet, these Soviet started springing up all across Russia. So they were established all across Russia, right? Cool. There was another very important thing that happened after February. Okay, now if we jump 2 months later to April, right? If we jump 2 months later to April 1917, you will realize that one of the most influential figures of the revolution, right, which was Vladimir Lenin. Okay, one of the most influential figures of the Russian Revolution, which was Vladimir Lenin. He returned to Russia in April 1917. Okay, he returned to Russia in April 1917 from his exile in Switzerland. Okay, so he was essentially in exile. Okay, so he was in exile. He was sent to exile by the Tsar for trying to spread unrest in the society. Okay, so he was exiled to Russia, exiled from Russia to Switzerland. Right. Vladimir Lenin, when he came back in April 1917, he came back with a list of demands for the provisional government. Okay, he basically had three demands. Okay, he basically had three demands. These demands are otherwise known as Lenin's April thesis. Okay, these are the names of the three demands. So if someone asks what is your opinion on Lenin's April thesis, then in that particular case you're going to list out the 3 demands. Right, the first and the foremost demand that Lenin had was that the war that was happening, the First World War, right, at that point of time, war should be brought to an end. Okay, the war should be brought to an end was his first demand, right? Because he thought that the war is pointless, it's an absolute waste of resources, and that Russia is not really doing well in the war in any case. So he thought that the war should be brought to an end. Then he said that the land in the countryside, okay, the land should be transferred, right? The land should be transferred to the peasants, is what he said. Okay, the land should be transferred to the peasants. Basically, the landlords should no longer be having control of the land, and all the land should be essentially transferred to the peasants. And last but not the least, he also said that Russian banks should be nationalized. Okay, like for example, in India, you have national banks such as the SBI, IDBI, Canara, so on and so forth. State Bank of Baroda, State Bank of Hyderabad, State Bank of, I don't know, so many state banks, right? So he said that banks should be nationalized, right? They should essentially be under the control of the government. So these were Lenin's 3 demands as soon as he came back from exile. Okay, he basically was not a huge fan. Okay, he was not a huge fan of the provisional government. Okay, he had issues with the provisional government. Like, he was not a big fan. What his contention in life was that he wanted the Soviets to stage an armed socialist revolution, so to speak. Okay, right, so he wanted the socialists to stage an armed socialist revolution. He wanted the Bolsheviks to stage an armed socialist revolution and overthrow the provisional government in order to establish, in order to establish a socialist state. That was his aim. He also wanted other things. He wanted that the Bolshevik party, that was his own party, should now call itself the Communist Party, is what he wanted. Okay, he wanted that the Bolshevik party should now call itself the Communist Party, so that the name itself, right, can convey the so-called radical aims. Okay, the Communist Party can now, if it was to be renamed from the Bolshevik Party to the Communist Party, the name Communist Party will apparently try to convey the radical sentiments of the party itself, the radical ideology or the radical aims of the party itself. Okay, so he comes back from exile and he starts ranting off all of these things. Okay, now some members of the Bolshevik party, okay, of his own party, okay, some of the members of the Bolshevik party did not agree with Lenin. Okay, this is a big thing. So some members of the Bolshevik party did not agree with Lenin, did not initially support him. That's a very, very, very valid reason for that. Okay, most of them felt that as of now, Russia has gone through a really turbulent period. The monarch has been acting crazy. And now that the provisional government has been set up, they wanted to support the provisional government. Okay, they were nice people, I guess. So they said that we should support the provisional government, okay, instead of trying to launch a full scale armed socialist revolution. Okay, so we should support the provisional government, we should try to bring about peace in Russia, and we should not really go about staging a revolution. But Lenin had other plans. Okay, Lenin had other plans. He knew that in order to stage an armed socialist revolution, in order to overthrow the provisional government, he will have to get the support of the two major forces in the Russian society, right? They were, of course, the workers, and they were, of course, the peasants. Okay, so what Lenin tried to do was that along with the Bolsheviks, most of the Bolsheviks who were still in support of him, okay, he first went to the industrial areas of Russia. Okay, he first went to the industrial areas of Russia. He tried to create unrest amongst the workers. Okay, tried to create unrest amongst the workers, right? And he basically began to incite them in order to launch this socialist revolution. And funnily enough, the workers in these countryside got incited by Lenin's fiery speeches and demands. So what happened was, now even more number of factory committees were being created. Okay, even a larger number of factory committees were being created, right? And what was now happening was that these factory committees started questioning the industrialists on their business practices, in especially in terms of their profit, how much are they getting, why is it not being shared with the workers, why is this unequal distribution of wealth happening, the usual stuff. Okay, so they started questioning industrialists to an extent that now even army had soldiers committees that were being formed. Number of trade unions had significantly increased, and there was a lot of problem happening. Okay, because of Lenin and going and trying to incite the workers and the peasants, right? Now if we talk about the peasants themselves, right, so he went and tried to create unrest. Okay, he tried to create unrest amongst the peasants. He argued for a redistribution of land. Okay, he argued for a redistribution of land in the countryside. Makes sense? Basically what he wanted was that land should no longer be controlled by the landlords, it should all be redistributed amongst the peasants, right? So he went and incited the peasants, telling them that what, this land actually belongs to you, and the landowners have no business basically trying to control your own land for you, right? Great. So now what happens is, because of this, there is violence that is happening in the countryside. Okay, now what is happening is that the peasants began to seize their lands. Okay, the peasants began to seize their lands and farms and whatever between July to September 1917. And of course there is a lot of violence that happens, there is a lot of bloodshed that is happening, right? Things are not looking too bright, and clearly Lenin has successfully managed to ignite both the workers and the peasants, which is problematic, right? Now you realize that Lenin has created this problem. Okay, now the provisional government starts getting paranoid because of all of this. Okay, the provisional government thinks that its power is reducing. Okay, its power is reducing, and the Bolshevik influence under Lenin, right? The Bolshevik party, as you're aware, now the Bolshevik influence under Lenin is increasing. That is what the provisional government thought. Now, when the provisional government came into the picture, they wanted to make sure that people are not subjected to the same atrocities that they faced under the Tsar. Okay, they literally start doing the same things that the Tsar did. They began arresting Bolshevik leaders. Okay, they began arresting Bolshevik leaders. Then, of course, they started attacking the rallies and the demonstrations that were being led by the Bolsheviks. They used the military against them. They locked the leaders up in jail, and of course, they tried to stop the workers through means of violence from taking over the factories, from seizing the means of production. Right. So now you realize that this is becoming a problem wherein there is unrest amongst workers. Okay, there is unrest amongst workers. Then there is, of course, unrest in the countryside amongst the peasants. And last but not the least, you realize that the provisional government is at loggerheads versus the Bolsheviks, which is also kind of problematic. Now, all of this conflict that is happening all the way from the time that Lenin comes back into the picture until the month of September 1917, right, you will realize that there is a lot of conflict happening at the worker level, at the peasant level, between the provisional government and the Bolsheviks. This is going to culminate in the form of a socialist uprising. Okay, this is going to culminate in the form of a socialist uprising called the October Revolution of 1917, which we shall discuss in the next installment. We would be looking at what the October Revolution of 1917 was, what was the backdrop, who were the people involved, so on and so forth. But until then, please take care, stay safe, and have a good day. Bye bye.